This is the TechStart podcast. Tech professionals, remote workers, and entrepreneurs who are leaving the rat race and starting a new life in Southern Colorado.
Welcome to the show. I'm here with my co-host, Ash Arnold, and today we've got Phil Lund on the show with us. So welcome to the show, Phil.
Hey, I'm happy to be here, Matthias and Ashley.
Hey, it is so awesome to have you here. Why don't you just start a little bit by filling in the listeners on some of the projects that you've got going here with St. Scholastica here in Canyon.
Yeah, that was the former name for it, St. Scholastica Academy, of course, and that was a girls' school run by a Catholic organization for 110 years on that campus, and it's about 4 or 5 blocks from downtown on the north end of 7th Street is where it's at on Pike Avenue. And so that was a 7.5 acre campus. As I mentioned, the girls' school for 110 years, and then they had another little school in there for just a little period of time. But mostly it's been vacant for a dozen years. And as a result, some of the buildings have deteriorated, and we're trying to revitalize that campus.
So there have been different people who've been have taken a look at that campus over the years. And I'm curious, if we just want to go back into the beginning of the story, what was it that drew your interest in revitalizing that project?
Well, we didn't have a grand plan when we got into this. So we were actually interested in the lots that were along Floral. And when I approached the owner at that time about those lots, I found out that those were actually not lots because it hadn't went through the process with the Planning Commission and the City Council. So at that point, he knew a little bit about my background after I told him, and so he engaged me to start with the plan unit development process. And after about 30 days, he approached me about actually purchasing the property and him getting out of that and pursuing other things that he does. So gave that thought, and after some negotiation, we ended up with a purchase agreement that allowed us to move forward. And our vision, my vision specifically, is much different than what his was. He had a very different vision as far as what the property was going to be about.
Cool. Do you want to fill us in a little bit about what you've got going there? Because you've got a number of different projects kind of happening in that.
Yep.
That site.
Yep, I'll be happy to. So we're trying to create assets, and first thing you have to do is get rid of the liability. So there were buildings on that campus that were in pretty bad shape, and again, a true liability to the overall campus, the overall project, and in fact, the overall neighborhood. And so the first thing is to eliminate those liabilities, which included the gym, the pool, the tennis courts. There was an auditorium that was attached to the classroom building that was in need of going away too because it was sinking and pulling the classroom building with it. And then there was a walkway. So those were, from a building standpoint, the liabilities. And it also had some asbestos on campus. We've pretty much taken care of that as well. And so now you're left with assets. And the assets on the campus, just to talk a little more in detail about that, is the old dormitory. And we have a plan of converting that into 43 condominiums. So those are going to be owner-occupied, or they can do whatever they want. If they want to lease it out, they can do that as well. We're giving a lot of flexibility, but they're going to be market value condos that they can purchase. And then the chapel building, the old chapel building there, and the classroom building, once the auditorium's removed, and then the big historic building, lend themselves to office space. So we're working, we've already got the zoning passed and finishing up the subdivision process to make that into a place that people can do business there. And we've got several businesses identified as far as looking in there. And then the north end, there's going to be 13 single-family homes. Canyon City is in need of housing as well as jobs. And so this campus allows for both jobs and housing to take place there. And coupled with that whole thing is some green space that, goes down through the center of the campus and just ties the whole thing together.
Yeah. That's fantastic. So, I mean, as you know, this podcast is kind of centered around the digital nomad, but also then around companies who want to move their workforce into a rural community, give them a bit of a better lifestyle at a lower cost investment. And I'm curious, I know this is something that you care about.
It is, very much so.
And I'm curious kind of how you see this project tying into that, because there's some clear tie-ins from.
Yeah, there is. So, from an infrastructure standpoint, we're creating both. We're creating the buildings themselves is one. There's 8,700 square feet. There's another one that's 4,400 square feet, and another one that's over 15,000 square feet. And so, you need that infrastructure for businesses to actually operate. And I've done a lot of stuff with a condominium model, and often people think of condominium as just simply residential. That's not the case. It's just a form of ownership. And so looking at splitting the classroom into 4 different quads, and that could be owned by 4 different companies that want to do business there, sharing the expenses, et cetera. So from a infrastructure standpoint, the campus lends itself to that. And then from a housing standpoint, which is the second side of the same coin, we've got varied sizes and price ranges as a result of that, of either a single-family home at one end or multi-family, but various sizes on the condominium. So the campus itself becomes this place that you could actually live and work right on the same campus. And if you want to have a bicycle lifestyle or a walking lifestyle, you certainly could have that as well. So again, creating the opportunity for people to pursue exactly what you're talking about, a digital nomad, or living and working in the same campus, and keeping your expenses low in this rural small town environment as compared to what you face in California or Washington or other places like that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we've talked about here in Canyon is and in the Upper Arkansas region is we don't just want to do something that we do here, but we want to create a model for other communities to follow. And I think sometimes, especially if you are a digital nomad, it can be easy to miss some of the infrastructure that if you go to different locations, the infrastructure that has been created that facilitates that for you to plug in.
Yeah, right on. And I kind of view this as the first step as well. Canyon's been doing really good stuff, and you guys are involved with just really cool projects and TechStart and et cetera. And but from my perspective, this is a good foundation or first step. I take it very seriously that we need to be successful to keep the momentum going and propel this thing forward and create new opportunities in the future. So get this one done. Look at the opportunities for the next one.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Hey, so Phil, I have a question. I think I hear a bit of Michigan in your voice. Were you involved in development projects in Michigan as well, or have you been doing these kinds of projects nationwide, or is this kind of a new look for your organization?
Well, you certainly have a good ear, because I lived the majority of my life in Michigan. So way to go on picking up my tone there. I
might be from Chicago. That's why.
I understand. You had to have the ear for it. But the answer to your question specifically is this has been a passion all my life. I actually started the Economic Development Organization with another person back in my county. It took us 5 years to do it back in Michigan.
Oh, wow. And
that's still operating today, some more than 10 years and less than 20 years later. It's still going. And then I also led a strategic planning initiative in my county as well. It was a countywide initiative that was funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation in the past. It had our county name to it, but the focus was on tomorrow. And we would take people from various disciplines, education, infrastructure, road commission, all kinds of places, and cross-populate them into various committees. And we focused on education and training, economic development, quality of life, a number of other issues and come up with very specific agendas for propelling the county forward. So that was a 2.5-year, 3-year project, and I was, again, the director of that. So, and I've served in a county board of commissioner in the past. So, yeah, this is a long-running passion of mine, and I just think Canyon City has got so many assets. I do have perspective of working with a lot of different communities, and Canyon's top-notch. And I mentioned one issue in there that I think is absolutely critical is quality of life. Canyon City, Fremont County is just exceptional in the quality of life opportunities here. So you got to have that as well. And it certainly has it with recreational opportunities. Great place to raise
Well, it's interesting to me that you've chosen this coming from a perspective of you've had such a career in kind of economic development, and I know kind of the new term for a little bit of what you're doing. I guess is kind of we call it rural reshoring, right? Repurposing, right?
Right.
And
Sure.
I think what's been so interesting about this project and with someone with your experience is when you kind of look at communities from a economic development perspective and kind of rebuilding it, have you seen the tech sectors spike more than usual than any other, like more than manufacturing or another industry? I always, when we talk about the Upper Ark Tech Partnership and we talk about Fremont and what we talk about in Chafee is we always look at why this partnership has been so successful, and because of the seat you had in Michigan, I think you might really understand this question. I think that the definition of what has been so successful is that this partnership has been technology agnostic or technology related, but industry agnostic, and I think that's what's driven so many different passionate people and new businesses and new ideas to the Fremont area. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if I'm understanding the question, Ashley, what's coming to mind on my side is tech crosses all industries. So it's not, you can talk about tech, but tech changes manufacturing, tech changes real estate, tech changes all kinds of, retail. So, when you talk about tech, it feeds into all these areas, and so you've got opportunities across the board. Wherever you're at, you can bring more technology into it and, be an entrepreneur, change the way business is done because you're leveraging technology. And that can be done anywhere. If I can just tell you just a little more about that, I came from a little town called Greenville, Michigan, and Greenville, you guys were probably not old enough, but there was a Gibson brand of refrigeration that was out there, and that company ended up employing 3,500 employees at one time, and it created, just a huge amount of supplier companies there. But it was created by a guy that grew up in that community, and he made that happen from an entrepreneurial standpoint. Ended up being Electrolux is, I think, where it ended up. And then, unfortunately, they chose from Stockholm to move it to Mexico. There was another company, if you're from the Midwest, and you may know this, Ashley, from being from Chicago, company called Meijer, which is the Walmart of that area. They actually did the Walmart thing prior to Walmart doing it. Fred Meyer started that process. Fred was also from Greenville. And so this huge company, they're the richest people in Michigan, the Meyers are, as a result of this, and throughout the Midwest, you would be familiar with them. They started that. So you had this little town of 8,000 people. You had two very significant, and there were other ones besides those, but just reference those. One started a refrigeration company, one started a retail company, and this was a town of 8,000 people, which is half the size of what Canyon City is. Mm-hmm. And so there really isn't anything, in my viewpoint, that you can't start here in Canyon City, and the sky's the limit as far as what the possibilities are. It's just a matter of us being creative and thinking through it and getting the support of the local government so they don't impede it, and making some things happen.
So I'm curious to hear from that, because that sounds like kind of a unique economic culture that was created there. And I'm curious, were there specific things that fostered that, or was it just really interesting people who were motivated, who had ideas and decided to go after it?
Well, they were from different generations. So the Gibson thing actually started in the late 1800s, and it went from there. They kept improving the refrigeration that they had. The original ones were just wooden boxes that they would put ice in. And, sure. It continued to this day. They're still out there. And Meijer started his in about 62, 63 when he really started his Meijer Thrifty Acres is what it was. And, it's kind of a drugstore, but then he started selling multiple things as opposed to just having groceries in there. He started adding different things. And, yeah, it takes a certain person to be an entrepreneur, but, those people are out there, and sometimes the encouragement. I've been reading, if I can just go a little further on this, about various countries that have turned themselves around, and they did so in a generation. And it wasn't just one person. It was lots of them. So the two that come to mind is Israel. Israel, just one generation ago, was pretty much, if I can, without too much politics here, but socialist in its nature. It wasn't fostering a lot of entrepreneurship. Now they are the leading country on this planet for entrepreneurship and creativity, and they just kind of allowed the government to get out of the way, and people got that dynamic going and made it happen. And the other one is China. We may view those people as a communist government, but they are entrepreneurial to the core, and also in a generation, they have completely changed that country around, and just phenomenal growth, and advancing technology well beyond what we in the United States might be used to on a daily basis. So that can happen anywhere, and it's a matter of the culture, and it can happen in small town environments, and it's a matter of us making the process or facilitating that so those things can happen.
Yeah.
I think if you do look at communities, if you look at Israel and you do look at what's happened in China, and you do look at the rate of study that entrepreneurs are taking in their education and then going on to run the businesses, you can really begin a new philosophy somewhere. And Canyon is really neat because it's right at the beginning of deciding who it's going to be now, right? And
yep,
I think what's been so fascinating with what your project is doing, and a little bit of some of the amazing startups we've seen just in the last 8 months that just kind of really taken our tech partnership up about 7 notches to, okay, I think I have a business plan for my company, to, okay, we're getting written up in Forbes now, and, we've got authors speaking for us on TED Talks, and it's become kind of a way of life in this incubation with the TechStart group that we've seen. So I am interested to see, especially because, there's been so much work done with the P-Tech program in terms of getting student interns involved in a bit of technology and understanding the basic sciences, like math. We've got programs. A gentleman, Gregory Carlson, works with Blickle that helps teach math, but really it's about teaching coding, and so he teaches coding through math, and it's really interesting, and vice versa. He's kind of got a really neat company going there, and I think River Science is teaching kids about drones and also river restoration, which is fantastic, because the kinds of startups that we're seeing and the kinds of companies that have grown over the last two years, I want to say, are really putting the kids in a position to be on a roadmap that's surrounded by technology, but okay, great, technology, but how do we apply it to a life science, or how do we apply it to a trade? And that's what's been so much fun with the partnership, and I'm interested to see what you're hoping your development brings in as far as a variety of businesses and whatnot.
Yeah, we're looking to keep, before I go down that road, I want to just address one thing you said, Ashley, which I think is a critical component. You were talking about a way of life, used that term, and that way of life can also be translated as culture. And culture is absolutely critical. It can fight against you, or it can be for you as far as a community. And if you can get a culture that has an upward momentum and entrepreneurial in nature, and it feeds up from the school systems, it feeds up from the government, it feeds up from the capitalization, so the banks or however capitalization is done, just amazing stuff can be done, because that upward momentum just becomes really significant. And the same thing is true on the negative side. The culture can completely work against an entrepreneurial environment, and you got to make sure you deal with that as well. And my experience is it's viral. I used to deal with a lot of organizations, and I have no idea who's going to hear this podcast, so I'm not going to name names, but I would go around to a lot of government organizations in a role that I had, and every one of them had a culture. And you'd walk in, and they were either really happy to see people because I'd sit through a whole meeting, or they were very negative towards people. And they would have elections, and 2 or 3 members would get replaced, but it was viral in the fact that it would always transfer to the next people, and it wasn't long before they caught the virus, whether it was a good virus or a bad virus. And we've got to make sure that we've got a good virus here. I remember Maple Valley Township. I always loved going to Maple Valley Township. Michigan has townships. We don't have them here in Colorado. And they were always the happiest people to have people in the door. They were positive as far as making things happen. And 2 other members got elected, and they caught that virus. And we've got to make sure the virus going around Canyon City, Fremont County, is a virus that we're here to make things happen, and we're in favor of creativity, and we've got support structures in banking, we've got support structures in education, the local governments, all that kind of feeds into this one overall culture that creativity is something that we want to pursue. So as far as St. Scholastica or Scholastica campus, we're providing infrastructure, but we also want to be a voice for that kind of environment to create it. We're a piece in the puzzle, and there's lots of puzzle pieces, but we're happy to be our piece.
Phil, what you said resonates very deeply with me. I think, just to add to that, if you add in a whole bunch of people in that mix who are resilient against negative viruses, and we make sure that our immune system is strong against that negativity, and we band together around that creativity, that's one of the things that we can do to protect the growth that has already happened and to perpetuate it.
You're right on, Matthias. Go ahead. I want to let you finish your thought there, but I've got a thought that I want to add to it when you get done.
No, I think your point is so vital, and it's so needed. I want to highlight it.
So you're talking about having the white blood cells ready to take on the virus if it's negative and be resistant against that, and those forces can happen from without and they can happen from within. So I experienced 2008 and the whole housing market crashing and the banks shutting down credit on any kind of business there was. If they had a loan of credit or a line of credit, they would send them a letter and say, whatever you got on your line of credit as far as what you borrowed, that's it. And companies would close because that was their cash flow during different times in their business life cycle, et cetera. And so that kind of stuff can happen again. It is something that I'm in favor of, some kind of thought process about resilience in a small community. And, it can be an economic thing that we need to resist. It can be, something that is just attitude-wise, news or whatever. And if you've got the resilience to resist the stuff you're talking about, Matthias, I think you're right on that you resist the negative and you accentuate the positive, and you can move a community forward farther than I think most people even realize. And it's always a surprise, I think, when you get moving, that you just don't know what you're going to come up with as far as somebody coming up with a good idea, and they wake up one morning, they've got it, and how do we make that happen?
So I've got a question for you on that note, because so as a small town, small towns and rural communities are highly impacted by economic ebbs and flows, and I'm just curious to hear your perspective on, from an economic standpoint, what are practical ways that as a rural community we can build in economic resiliency?
Well, I think it's absolutely critical that discussion takes place, because our transportation infrastructure is a lot more fragile than I think most people realize, as far as it could be shut down and you're dealing with some things. So, as an example, just off the top of my head, you walk through the large store in town, Walmart, and you see walk through the aisles and what can we produce locally? I think globalization throughout the centuries has went back and forth as far as the ebb, and right now it is definitely on the decentralized portion, and communities becoming more resilient because they produce things locally, whether it's their food source, making sure that takes place, or anything else that can be produced locally. You have a chance to do that, especially with 3D printers. So the technology lends itself to that kind of thing, as opposed to sending something clean across the country or across an ocean. 3D printers, artificial intelligence, just all kinds of stuff that allow us to start making things locally and come up with a local distribution process, and create the economy so it's not so susceptible to the shock waves.
Yeah.
I think Phil, what you're really kind of trying to articulate is, I think I too was heavily involved and affected by, I worked for a number of tech companies from 2008 to 2010, and they got hit really, really hard. And I think the biggest lesson I learned was, in 2008, probably through to 2011, it was really okay to be bulky, right? It was okay as an organization to be bulky. Overhead was like the biggest issue. And I think what we've seen that's really happened, and it's going to sound like a broad generalization, but I think what we've seen, because of the rapid speed of technology, the way tasks are done, the way we've been able to outsource pieces of it to different companies, even locally. I mean, I don't mean outsource in the sense of out of the country, but just understanding that a company does not have to have marketing next door to the legal, and we don't need these big legal departments in-house. We can use lawyers and accountants, because of this remote economy that we're in, we're able to kind of thin down the organization. And so I think what we've seen and what enables us to have the luxury of coming to smaller communities and being able to innovate in them, I think the biggest thing is the word nimble, right? And being flexible and knowing that you do not have to have that legacy infrastructure that so much of us grew up learning about, and learning that, there was going to be an HR department, there was going to be this, there was going to be that, all these departments, instead of focusing on what the heartbeat of the business really was. And I think we're at a time, which we're really lucky to be in, where the heartbeat of innovation really can just be the heartbeat of innovation, and the details of the wins and hows and the paperwork and the smaller things that not every entrepreneur is great at, have the resource in a smaller microcosm. They can get the resources they need and still keep their company fresh and on the cutting edge and focus on what they're really trying to bleed into the universe.
Yeah, it's the core competencies. What is your core competency? And beyond that, you really can look at outsourcing. And again, it's not outsourcing overseas. It's the accountant, whoever it is, the legal side of it can be right next door, and you're taking advantage of that. The other thing, entrepreneurs make mistakes, of course, and I've made a few, and they'll stick with you. They're expensive, and they're you just know them. But I also had a chance to teach a little bit of entrepreneurship at the college level, which was fun. And one of the things I always talk to entrepreneurs about is don't put yourself in the vortex of your company. Because if you are the key asset and you have nothing to sell. It's much more focused on building the company outside of yourself, whether it's tech or whatever it is. And then, it's like an automobile. You can hand over the keys to somebody else, and you've got an exit strategy that works. But if you are the core competency, if you are that person that holds it together, you really are undermining the value and the growth of your company because you're putting yourself too much right in the center of all the action. Build it outside of yourself. And so there's key things like that too. You talked about, the dynamics of these people in Greenville, Michigan. Were they, something special, or, how it happens? And I think it's just simply education. Entrepreneurship can be educated as far as some of the mistakes. You don't have to make every mistake, because a bunch of us have already made them, and learn from those mistakes. And in a small community, we just need to be sharing that stuff back and forth as far as life lessons that help us all move forward.
So I'm curious if you'd be willing to share, you don't have to go into the details of the situations if you don't want to, but what are some of those life lessons that you've learned along the way?
Oh, let's see if I can come up with a couple of them. One is just things change. And, I was fairly successful in the early 2000s. I'd left a company, and we did a business deal, and that was successful. And you learn some things from success, but you learn a lot more from the failure side of the fence. And so you got to be willing to fail. Entrepreneurship is about failure. It's about, I could give the examples of Walt Disney and Edison, and we've all heard those examples. Well, they're true, that you got to be willing to move forward. And again, the paying attention to the circumstances. Things will always change. The dynamics are always changing. It's a very fluid environment. And if you're not paying attention to that, and you think that things are going to be consistent, you're just flat out wrong. It's not. We're in more changing environment than we've ever been. So you can't keep the glasses on and look at the world from just a certain perspective and think that your formula is always going to exist, because it won't. I mean, we can look at all kinds of companies, video companies that they used to be on almost every corner, and now they no longer exist. And there's example after example of that. So, but the other point is that it's a real opportunity. You could take on GE or any big corporation that Ashley was talking about that has the human resources department and everything else, because they are so stodgy and so bureaucratic in their environment that a nimble company, as Ashley was talking about, can win. And so keep your company small and come to a small community like Canyon City, Florence, Penrose, Fremont County, and good things can come of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's jumping back to some of the culture shift and mindset shift. I think that's something important to keep in mind as a rural community, because I think it's sometimes easy to look at a small community and take for granted that you actually do have a shot at competing against, whether it's a big company or whether it's a big city or whatever it is, that you do have an edge, and that is it right there.
It is an edge, and I'm only 2 years into Canyon City, and I lived 4 years in Denver area, and then before that, everything was in Michigan, and hence my accent, Ashley. But I am amazed on the talent that is here, specifically in Canyon City. I bump into people all the time that have got significant experience beyond Canyon City, who are extremely talented individuals, and these are real assets to the community, and it's a matter of leveraging those assets. That's the other piece, is that with all the infrastructure and the stuff that is here from a recreational standpoint, nonetheless, people are the biggest assets. And what Brad is doing, what Chris is doing, what you guys are doing with this podcast, and what the organizations which represent people are doing, tremendous asset to this community. And it's a matter of leveraging them. And I can tell you that there's a bunch of people out there that still are sitting in the weeds, if you will, and can be brought into the fold. And I don't mean from a psychological standpoint, just simply their talents, their skills, their abilities, their experience, and to move the community forward. So
yeah, that's right. That's exciting. I had a question too. Jumping back a little bit, you talked about the entrepreneurship is partially skill, it's partially personality, and you also mentioned your education. And I'm curious about your thoughts or perspective on whether it's the PTech program or some of the other programs, or even just possible solutions on how do we help kids recognize whether it's an entrepreneurial talent or like an engineering talent, get them from disappearing into the weeds and actually help them develop that, because that's a significant part of our asset as well.
It is, and there's risk involved with that. I was a business major, and you grow up, and the goal is to get yourself a good job and do those jobby kind of stuff. Get yourself a house, live, pay your mortgage, and show up for work every day and advance through the company, et cetera. And that just isn't the mindset of an entrepreneur. There's risk in being an entrepreneur. You're not always going to be successful, but you're creating a mindset that is different. Now, when I grew up in Michigan, we were part of the Industrial Revolution. Detroit was the Silicon Valley of the 60s and 70s, certainly the 60s, it was the place where innovation was happening in those plants, et cetera. But it had that industrial mindset as far as, we're going to have this department and this department, as Ashley was speaking of. And look where it's at today. There's manufacturing, but a lot of them, it's AI that's happening. It's just a completely different environment than what it was. And we've got to suggest to people that entrepreneurship is just as valid. And now in the 21st century, you're not going to go find yourself a 30-year job or a 20-year job or a 5-year job even. Most kids today will have just oodles of job if they go down through that. So I think the job market, or pursuing jobs, this might sound a little radical to your listeners, but I think that's the biggest risk, is to have that mindset that all of this is about getting a job. There's another way of looking at the thing, and that's from an entrepreneurial standpoint, that I'm going to go out and create something new. And let me just give a definitional thing there. An entrepreneur, in my mind, is someone who is creating something new. They're a creative human being, male, female, old, young, it doesn't matter. And they're creating something new. There's another concept that I always talked about is a business in a box, and that's McDonald's. Nothing against McDonald's, but it's the formula. Here's your formula, and we know that it's going to be successful, and so you implement this formula, and that works. I don't consider that person an entrepreneur. They absolutely are a business owner, but an entrepreneur is on the creative side. And so you want to see a community prosper. In Israel, China, again, we're dealing with macro on that level, but nonetheless, from an example standpoint, it's the entrepreneurial stuff. They're creating something new. They're creating new possibilities existing. And we can do that on the same way in a small community like this. We don't need to be, China with a billion people, or in Israel with 7 million people. We can do something in Fremont County, but it goes back to that cultural thing. We're trying to create, get people into jobs and have them, become this thing that people send us work, and we do that. That's one thing. But if we can create something new, you just never know where that's going to go.
Yeah, that's well said. That's fantastic. So I also have a question. What actually brought you down to Canyon?
Coming down and looking at the Royal Gorge and things like that. I was doing some activity where I just like to get around, and Canyon and this area has a lot going on with it. And when I got into Canyon my first time, I thought, I like this town. And it was about a year and a half or 2 years later that my partner and I came down, and we saw a house that was for sale and grabbed a hold of that. Quite frankly, I was completely out of the real estate business, and I've never sold it much for other people with that, but I've done a lot of projects, and never anticipated actually getting back into it. And then there was an opportunity here and another opportunity, and then we ended up buying the apartment complex and converting that into condos, and then we're doing a Scholastica course. So
that's awesome.
It was the quality of life of Canyon City.
Yeah.
I just love the opportunities here. I like Phantom Canyon Drive. Every time somebody comes into town to visit, I always take them Phantom Canyon and a lot of other drives and hiking and whitewater rafting and just all the opportunities that are here. I will say this: Canyon City is my final home. I love it enough that this is where I'm staying put. I'm going to hang my hat here, and whether how many projects I do or not do, Canyon City is a great place. So
yeah, that's awesome. Phil, you remind me of the kind of person who's always got you've got something stirring inside of you, something cooking. Like you're never. I don't imagine you to be the kind of person who's going to reach a finish line and be like, okay, like this is it. I hear you talking about the Scholastica campus and some of your vision for it, and I know you want to put your focus and energy into that. But have you given thought to what's next after that?
Yeah, I have. I have no concept of retirement. I just have no interest in it whatsoever. And, the way health organizations exist nowadays and everything else, I'm not certain anybody else should either to do that. So one of the concepts I've been interested in, and it fits into this, is if you don't mind me just expressing an entrepreneurial idea that I'm willing to toss out there, and if somebody wants to steal it, they can do that. But it's a concept that I call an economic pod. And so there's 93 million Americans who are outside of the workforce. And that is true today, even though unemployment is at 3%. So it's just a matter of how the government deals with it. And I agree the economy is doing some good things, and there's some challenges that I think are out there as well. But a pod is, it gets back to that concept of everyone doing something for everyone else, and we all benefit from it. So, for instance, you take this pod, and you can think of it as dolphin pods, or you can think of a pod that you put in the ground and it grows and new growth coming out of it. But you slice out all the things that people need things. And it's computer programming, it's marketing, it's legal, it's sewing, it's growing tomatoes, it's all those things. And then everybody signs up for their piece that they've got competence in, and they choose to do business with one another through some kind of computer program that allows for that facilitation to take place. So there's things out there that are kind of like it. Craigslist and all the fraud that goes place there. There's other things where you verify people's trust and those things. But this is creating an organization for people that are outside of the workforce and they want to bring their talents and skills. And, it's kind of taking the old West where you come across on the wagon train and you'd bring your banker, your butcher, your candlestick maker with you. And you had to have that diversity of talents and skills because the next town away was 100 miles away, and on horseback, that's quite far. Well, how do you make that work locally and use 21st century skills with, social media and everything else so that we all can do business with one another? That's an idea I've been playing around for a few years, and at some point I'm going to pick it up and push it forward.
That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah, it's a platform kind of thing, and, platforms are a good way for things to happen. Facebook is a platform, social media is a platform. You're using the platform right now for what we did for the call-in for the podcast. So I like the concept of a platform that facilitates people doing business with one another.
Actually, Phil, I've got the secret solution to your platform.
I'm all ears. What's that?
I built it. Well, no, I don't know if you've how familiar you are with blockchain, but
I am.
The whole essence of blockchain is that it runs on a smart contract, right? I mean, the blocks
Yep.
are unhackable, but they run on smart contracts, right?
Yep.
So all we really need to do is make a platform for people to post their strong suits in this ecosystem you're building, and put a smart contract behind each one, and then hopefully everybody plays nice. Yeah.
Actually, I've been watching what's happening with blockchain, and I think you're right on. I also like physical and not so much USD, but I've been toying around with just having it so it has a silver base, because silver is cheap compared to gold or something. So you could do both physical and you could do something with blockchain, and both of those have this trust aspect to it as far as dealing with transactions. So
I wanted to hone in on one concept you were saying, and you know what, I think it really struck me as meaningful as far as, Matthias and I get the opportunity to interview entrepreneurs like yourself all the time, and it's really inspiring to hear everybody's take on it. But for you to be so brave and to tell people to be so fearless, I think is probably one of the most inspiring lines we've heard in terms of being driven and kind of giving people permission to say, okay, go do what you're best at and understand what that best is. And I think if I've learned one thing from you, that the rest should follow. Am I right?
Yeah, to a great degree, that's true. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to fail, but you will learn from that failure and, keep going and persevere. Perseverance is a big thing. Again, having taught entrepreneurship, I know a little bit about some of the details. So Fast Magazine, and whatever the title is right now for it, it often puts the 20-something out there as the entrepreneur that's successful. And that's just not what's actually happening. The average person who starts a successful business is 45 years old. And if that's the average, of course, there's a lot more on the other side as far as plus 45. The average entrepreneur that is successful has started 3.8 businesses prior to that. So they've had at least 3.8 businesses that have failed. And again, that's an average. So there's people who have been successful after failing at 7 businesses. And you just got to keep going at it. So it is really rare for somebody to come up with their first idea and hit a home run out of that. That is just, and to be 20-something, those people make it on the top of the magazine covers, but that is not what the normal or the real thing that's happening out there. So.
You actually hit on a point that I think we need to spend a minute on. To your point, it's funny, the average age of the entrepreneurs that are actually kind of settled into something that might or might not work, they are 45, but what's interesting, I was reading an article, and I think it was about 5 years ago, and it was published by the Harvard Business Review, and it was centered around what we call the knowledge worker now, due to information technology and where we're at. It was interesting. Right. they were talking about the workforce today, and I always try to hone on this every podcast that we're in a pivot point right now where we've got about 4 generations entering and leaving the workforce, and with the way technology is working, it's a really interesting time. But what was most striking to me in the article was that they were discussing that the average employee or person that was, going to be a partner in an accounting firm, or same thing for a law firm, whatever that track was that you might have been in, you'd stay in the same position for 25, 35 years, and then kind of move up into this new role, and then slowly fade away, and fade into the organization, and then take on more of a consultative role or board seat with the company. And now with this knowledge worker deal, what we see people having mini careers, 5 years dabbling here, 5 years doing that. And what they were saying, and I forget the statistic, but what they were saying is a large percentage of people who had at least 5 or more of these 5-year type, what do you want to call it, journeys in whatever they're doing, they wind up starting a business more often than not. And I thought that was so interesting. It really stuck with me. And like I said, it's from 5 years ago, but I see it now more than ever. I see more people in their late 40s or early 50s just starting something brand new, and they are so excited, and they have no idea which way it's going to go, and they're scared, but they've finally figured out that it's okay if they fall. And to your point, if they fail, it's really not that big of a deal. But to see people who traditionally at that age have set down such roots, to see them saying, okay, I'm gonna give up what I was raised with, because we're in a cross-generational situation as far as the workforce, to see so many people walk away from tradition and throw away and recycle the ideas to do something new, but throw away that old thought process of 25 years I'm going to do the same thing, and they realize that I can take my 25 years of being really good at a bunch of skills and repurpose them to do something new, start a business. And they feel safe because their skill set's there, and it's so interesting to watch. I see it every day, and it inspires me constantly, because for once in my life, I see a group of people hungry enough to be okay to fail, and to see that fear go away is really inspiring.
Yep, no doubt about it. So the concept of a generation, it is meaningless from a work standpoint to think of a generation as an age at this point. A generation is technology changing over, and you can be 60 years old and fresh and growing and changing and right up on the latest technology. You can be 23, and if you haven't paid attention to it for the last 3 years, you're outdated. And so biological age becomes irrelevant in the whole story. It's dealing with the technology and leveraging it and making sure you're paying attention, because 3 years from now, it's going to change again. I mean, the technology age is down to less than 18 months is the last article I read about it. So the opportunity is there, and it's the mindset that you're talking about specifically to your listeners. If you're older, it's irrelevant. You can come to a Canyon City and have a quality of life, keep your level of expenses down, and you can create something that is new and refreshing. And with the internet, you've got access to the whole planet. So there's just, and you can go to TechStart and get great rent to get your business going. And the same thing is true when you're 23. So again, biological age, as you're talking about, Ashley, is now an irrelevant component of living in the 21st century. The opportunities are just more than ever. And that's another thing I would say is, whether you're male, you're female, whatever, however you identify yourself, there's never been an age of more opportunities than there are right now. And are there economic storm clouds on the horizon? There are. But, you can create something that will change that, a different way of doing business, a different way of, that's entrepreneurship as well. It's not just a product. It can be a service or a way of doing business. So all the platforms that have been created are basically all in the last 10 years.
That's awesome. Wow. It feels like this has gone so quickly. It's incredible. It's been fantastic talking with you, Phil. Ash, do you have any questions you want to ask before we wrap this up?
No, I think, Phil, I'm so excited to see how St. Scholastica works out. I'm so excited about your program. I think I couldn't be more excited for a project like that to take off in a community on the rise, with so many bright minds just ready to soak up as much knowledge as they can. And you're building some infrastructure for them to grow into, and I don't think there's anything more inspiring. So many people think of small towns and they don't think we do big time things, but the fact that you and your partners have come to our community and said, yes, you can do big things, and give us some room to do it, and give us a little bit of a infrastructure to do it and enough belief, I think is really a special thing.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And again, you are doing a part of the much larger puzzle that's here. And I guess I would end on one last thing is we've got to be smarter than the folks on Wall Street to pull this off. They have so much cushion with the central banks, pumping into the system that helps the Wall Street economy. And if you're going to do something on small town America, small town wherever, you got to be at your best game. And so I'm not encouraging anyone to slough off. I'm encouraging everyone to get on the track and be at their best. Do your best, excel, make excellence the standard that we have to live by in small communities, because we really do have to be wiser, smarter than the folks in a big New York, because, again, they've got so much advantage with the pumping of money and into it from central banks and et cetera. So we've got a lot of talented people here in Canyon City and Florence. I've met many, and where they live in Fremont County, and I think we should hang our doors open for other talent that want to come in. There's a lot of people moving in. We had some rentals, and we didn't rent to anybody in Canyon City. They were all people coming from without. So Canyon City is thriving and doing some good things. And if we get at our best game all together, there's amazing things that can be done.
Cool.
Well, here's to staying nimble, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you guys allowing me to participate tonight with you. You're just doing a fantastic job, and I just think good things are going to come in Canyon City, but it's got to be everyone stepping up to the plate. Again, the local government, the school system, the capitalization people or banks or however it is, and creating that environment. And you're certainly doing that by hosting this podcast and moving that forward. So congratulations on doing this, and however I can help you in the future, I'd like to do that.
That's awesome. It's been fantastic having you on the show, Phil. So thanks so much for your time. Can't wait until we can connect again.
We look forward to it.
Thanks for listening to the TechStart podcast. Find out more at techstart.fremontedc.com.